right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the July 3rd Thursday Web Forum for the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, or SECAS partnership. I am your host, Hillary Morris, and I work on user support and communications for the Southeast Conservation Blueprint. And SECAS hosts this web forum on the third Thursday of every month, right here at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, as an opportunity to share the latest updates on the blueprint, get input and involvement from folks like y'all, and highlight exciting science and action in the world of landscape conservation across the Southeast and Caribbean. So here's our usual agenda for the day. I'll start out by introducing our speaker, who will present for 30 to 40 minutes or so. We'll have time for Q&A and discussion at the end, and then I'll wrap up by previewing next month's webinar and sharing some updates from your SECAS staff. You probably noticed I am recording this webinar just for the handful of folks who might have wanted to come but had a conflict, and I will post the recording of that web forum on the calendar event from the SECAS website within a day or two. And if you ever have trouble finding that, you're always welcome to just shoot me a message or an email, and I'll be happy to send you that link. Any questions or comments before we get started? Well, then it only remains for me to introduce our speaker. Jacob Blandford is the Appalachia Landscape Conservation Coordinator for the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, and he's going to be talking today about the Appalachian Mountains and how they serve as a wildlife highway for climate adaptation. So, Jacob, take it away.
Are you seeing the slides?
Sure am, and I hear you great.
Great. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jacob Blandford. I'm the Appalachian Landscape Conservation Coordinator for the Center for Large Landscape Conservation. Really excited to be here. Thanks for having me. Thanks for spending your time this morning listening to this webinar. I'm going to dive in a little bit on who CLLC is, who the Center for Large Landscape Conservation is, our acronym CLLC. That'll just slip out. That's what I'm referring to. We're going to talk about who we are as an organization a little bit, and then I'll dive into our work in the Appalachian Mountains and our Appalachian program that I coordinate. So just, grand scheme of things, we are really dedicated to landscape scale conservation and connectivity. I mean, that is our bread and butter. And really with this idea of the climate resilience aspects of connectivity and making it so that the habitat is, the landscape supports the habitat and the species now and into the future. When I say large landscape conservation, I mean, we use that kind of as an umbrella term, but a large landscape in our, my mind is something that's transboundary. So we know jurisdiction ends at boundaries. We know habitats and wildlife do not. So working across boundaries or working within a whole boundary. For example, we're working in West Virginia, and we know that within West Virginia, there's multiple agencies and jurisdictions that have authority. And so working across those kind of the jurisdictional authority boundaries within a whole system, within a whole boundary, or thinking about a whole ecological system. So like the Appalachian Mountains as an ecological system, that is a large landscape. And then when we think about connectivity, we are mostly, almost entirely focused on terrestrial connectivity, although obviously there's an aquatic piece, and even, more and more recognizing those aren't separate things, that even aquatic and terrestrial connectivity are connected. So when we think about connectivity, we want to have, unimpeded movement of species, and the flow of natural processes. So of course the species move, but also, all of the ecosystem services and the benefits we get from nature, clean water, clean air, carbon sequestration. We want, all of those ecological processes depend on large areas of connected landscape. There's, of course, migrations like seasonal migrations, large game migrations, and then connectivity for climate change adaptation. The two that are bolded, the unimpeded movement of species and the flow of natural processes, and the climate change adaptation, is mostly what we're working on, like in the Appalachian Mountains. We don't necessarily have the big game migrations in this part of the world like they do out west or they do in other countries. And so really we're thinking about this kind of just day-to-day movement, and then this natural, the ability for species and habitats to adapt and move as the climate changes. We have a few geographic focuses. So, of course, the Appalachian program that I'll get more into, we're based in Montana, and so we do a lot of work in Montana. We're working in a handful of counties, 4 or 5 counties. Really strategically, they're the counties between Yellowstone National Park and then Glacier. And so you've got these two large protected areas, and in between is the space where a lot of wildlife moves, but of course there's also a lot of growth and development. And so trying to work in that area to sustainably and strategically inform development so that wildlife are still able to move through the area. And then we have quite a robust international program. Makes me want to work for the international program because they get to travel to a lot of cool places. So for instance, we have a linear infrastructure specialist who worked with the country of Costa Rica making a nationwide plan to mitigate wildlife vehicle collisions. Our international program and some of our science team just wrapped up a big long project in Canada. We're working with partners in Canada on management actions that help enhance connectivity. Working in Southeast Asia, one of the largest killers of Asian elephants is collisions with trains, and so thinking about how we can mitigate some of those impacts. So really, we've got a few strategic geographies within the U.S. and then work across the world as well. So, similar increasing resilience of large landscapes, we know if we have these large habitat blocks that are conserved and they're connected, the ecosystems are more resilient. They balance out, the wildlife will be able to adapt and respond as they need it. And so there's these kind of three buckets of outcomes we're looking at. Outcome one is increased number of corridors. And when we say corridors, these are, they're based on our work on our international program, there's like a definition of these that they are designated and managed specifically for wildlife movement. More appropriate in the Appalachians or in the east is this outcome 2, which is just land and waterscape permeability. So knowing, some states in the east have wildlife corridor plans and they have established corridors, but generally thinking we just need permeability so that wildlife can move across the landscape in more of a dispersed fashion, not necessarily through these designated like migration corridors or these wildlife corridors to protect those areas. And then, as I mentioned, linear infrastructure. So we know roads and bridges are one of the leading causes of fragmentation, as well as like power line transmission, railroads, as I had mentioned. So just thinking about how we can incorporate connectivity and wildlife movement into linear infrastructure planning and implementation. We have these kind of 4 big buckets where we work. So science and research, policy and planning, coordination and networking, and then on-the-ground implementation. So just kind of walk through a few examples of what we do. This is some of our science and research out in Montana. This is looking at Highway 191. It's a major thoroughfare in Montana, and of course it intersects elk migrations and these big animal movements. And so, our team of scientists look at starting on the left, like where are wildlife moving using GPS collars or camera traps. They can see where wildlife are moving. Then we can use carcass data or crash data to look at where wildlife vehicle collisions are happening. We can then assess where the habitat quality is on either side. So, where are the wildlife coming from and where are they trying to get to? And then when you combine all this together, you can then prioritize the location for wildlife crossings. And so this is work we've done out in Montana. And this was a big effort to help mitigate these collisions on this Highway 191, leading to some implementation of wildlife crossings. So this is the area I think we do. It's the least developed of our organization, but something we're trying to do more of. We don't do land acquisition. We're not out there actually restoring the land, but we do have expertise kind of in the program, the project management of getting these projects on the ground. And so based on the studies we've done that I showed in my previous slide, there's 4 wildlife crossings that we're working with Montana Fish and Wildlife Agency and their Department of Transportation on implementing. And so 2 of them will be bridges that are going to be retrofit to create shelves for wildlife to go under, and there would be construction of 2 new crossings, an overpass and an underpass. So trying to actually, it's not just the research, but actually getting the work on the ground that does connect habitats and allow wildlife movement. And then, of course, we've produced guidance and resource documents on how to kind of develop these wildlife crossings and fund them and implement them. We do quite a bit of policy and planning. So we've developed some guidance on incorporating connectivity into state wildlife action plans. We know in the U.S. a lot of land use planning comes from the local level, the municipality or the county level. So we've developed a toolkit for integrating wildlife into local land use planning, local government planning. Then we also work at like the federal level. We're not an advocacy organization, but we do have our U.S. policy team is really working to get the permanent authorization of the Wildlife Crossing Program, as well as some Farm Bill programs that support connectivity. So working across multiple scales from local to state to federal on policy and planning and getting connectivity, more incorporated in how we use the land. We do quite a bit of coordination and networking. That's what, I'm a coordinator. One of my main roles, I coordinate this Appalachian network that's emerging. And so, there's been a couple great reports recently. The Network for Landscape Conservation, it's a program under the CLLC umbrella, and they have this Catalyst Fund that supports new and emerging networks and collaboratives. And they just did an impact report on that. And the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation also just did a report on collaboration. And both of these reports, I demonstrated that these collaborations, these partnerships lead to durable connectivity and conservation outcomes. And so we're a big proponent of coordination among partnerships and networks and initiatives, however you want to call them, knowing that there's, it's too big of a problem for one agency, one organization to work on. We need to work together. So that's kind of the CLLC in a nutshell. And just kind of transitioning then to what we're doing in the Appalachian region. This is a new program. We've been working in the Appalachians through specific projects for 6 years, 7 years now, but we didn't have a dedicated program for it until last summer. I came on in September. I'm the first coordinator in this role. So it's a new program. We're still figuring out exactly our role and where we're going to put our time and efforts. And so with that in mind, I think that the big focus thinking about those 4 buckets I just talked about, coordination and networking is a big piece of the work in the Appalachians, and then policy and planning. There's a lot of science in the region already, and working with some of our state agency partners and some partner organizations, the desire is not for new science, but a synthesis of the science that's going on. And then, we haven't necessarily gotten into the implementation phase, although that's ultimately what all this works for, is to get more projects on the ground. So I was telling Hillary before this started that my master's degree, my early career was in marine conservation. I was working in Alabama on oyster reef restoration and salt marsh restoration. And I think I went into that line of work because I just hadn't spent enough time in the mountains to realize how cool they are. And the Appalachians especially are just this really unique system. We've got these really neat high elevation bogs. So, back some point in geologic time, these valleys got plugged and the water wasn't able to flow out. And so at these high elevations, you have these kind of bog wetlands that you don't find again until you get up to northern Canada. The higher elevation, the cooler temperatures mimic what you find in Canada. And so you get these really unique high elevation bogs. We have one of the largest remaining forests in the world left in the northern stretches of the Appalachian Mountains. I always, talk, thinking about with neighbors or talking to people in town here. I live in West Virginia, and you walk out the door and you see this forest, and it's just it's just your normal forest. This is just what a forest looks like. But in the grand scheme of things across the globe, we're in a really unique habitat here, this temperate broadleaf forest. There's just not much of it remaining across the globe, and a good portion of it is here in the Appalachians. It's referred to as the Appalachian Mountains, but in my opinion, it could be the Appalachian rivers and streams. We just have a lot of rivers and streams and water in this area. 2 of the oldest rivers in the world, the French Broad River and the New River, are in the Appalachian Mountains. And then, West Virginia, in their most recent State Wildlife Action Plan, had this map in there looking at all their aquatic habitat maps. And seeing this, it's amazing that I'm standing on solid ground. Across the whole state, across the whole region, there's just all of these rivers and streams and creeks and tributaries. And then even within that, if you look at this map, the red on the western half of the state is warm water streams. The blue and the purple on the eastern half of the state is cool water streams. And so even within our rivers and streams, you get a lot of this interesting diversity. And I think this diversity, the habitats you have, really show up when you're looking at habitat range maps. So if you look at like the flying squirrel there on the top left, they're typically found in the north in Canada, but due to the elevation in our habitats here, there's these islands of habitat that support, northern flying squirrel. Same with the eastern spotted skunk or the Swanson's warbler. So it's mammals, birds, reptiles, even plants. The small cranberry down in the lower right. You see these islands or these peninsulas of habitat that stick out on the Appalachian Mountains that are either further north or further south than what their normal habitat range is. And all of those neat habitats lead to really interesting biodiversity. So of course, highest biodiversity of salamanders anywhere in the world. I can safely cover up about a quarter of the globe because there are no salamander species in that part. So you're not missing anything behind that photo of salamanders. Same pattern with freshwater mussels. Same pattern with freshwater fish. You see the Appalachian Mountains show up in these. And then just across all biodiversity. The Appalachian Mountains just, pop out on these maps as a distinct geography with really high numbers of species and the unique habitats that support them. And we also know all of these animals are on the move, right? So even salamanders are moving. The distances might not be as far, but they're moving. This is a map, the West Virginia Division of Natural Resources, their wildlife program, did a deer tracking study. So this is deer ranges, their daily movement across 2 months back in 2021. And there, you can see kind of on average that's got about a mile range that they're moving. Some of them disperse further, but you see that thick yellow line at the bottom, that's Highway 64. You don't really see a lot of crossing there. So, it appears that highway is acting as a barrier to these movements. And then we also know, wildlife moving day to day, but habitats are also shifting with climate change. Looking at the past habitat versus future projections out to 50 to 100 years, you see a general shift north of something like the oak hickory or the Canada's not here, but if it was, you'd see that maple beech birch, the red shifting north. You see expansion and some contraction of different habitat types, and so as all of these changes in habitat, location, and abundance shift, the species that depend on them are also going to shift. And I'm sure you've seen this map at somewhere. It's like go to conferences and talking about Appalachians. It's just like this map is almost in every presentation at this point, but it's such a distinct map. So this is the TNC map showing where habitat is now, where it's going to be in the future, and then modeling the wildlife as they, follow those habitat shifts. And there is this clear convergence on the Appalachian Mountains. We know that, due to the elevation, due to many of the north-south valleys and streams, wildlife are going to use this it's modeled that wildlife will use this as a corridor chasing climate conditions and habitats. And so that along with some of our other work, motivated one of our first forays in the Appalachians, which was in partnership with the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, looking at conserving an intact and enduring Appalachian landscape, designing a corridor. That was the map I just showed. The flow map was a model, but what does it, what would it take to actually make that reality? In the Appalachian, the trail is just, thinking about it as like this backbone that we can build off of. It's iconic, it's just a really iconic, it's a well-known trail. It's promoted, it provides, economic benefits to the communities along it. And it's one of the earliest examples of landscape conservation, thinking about, going from just protecting the entire trail across the whole mountain range. That was phase one. That was a landscape level effort. And then phase two, they were able to establish a buffer across the whole trail. So it might only be 50 feet in some places, but the whole trail and a buffer on both sides is protected. And so now thinking about phase three, like how do we build off of that? How do we then protect a couple miles on each side. And so really, establishing that as the corridor expanding from the Appalachian Trail and using that as an anchor for connectivity. And so, thinking about this plan and designing and what it would take and that flow map, that's highlighting the Appalachians as like the corridor that wildlife are going to move through. This is a report this is a quote from that report, but just that perhaps no greater opportunity to advance large-scale landscape protection and then continuing that legacy of the Appalachian Trail and building on it. But when you actually look at the landscape, it's not quite so smooth. So these are photos. All of them were taken within 60 miles of where I live here in West Virginia. And not to demonize these things, like we need logging, we need agriculture. We obviously have to have local communities, but these are, when you look at the landscape and then that flow model is not as realistic, knowing that it's not this pristine corridor that wildlife can freely move through. And when you zoom out, you see this, on a bigger scale. So this is a map from the Open Space Institute's Appalachian Landscape Mapping Resource Center. Really cool resource from Open Space Institute. It's using, again, TNC's connected and resilient land data. The darker blue is where there is connectivity, where wildlife can move and adapt to climate change. The lighter kind of yellow-orange area is where there's development or it's disconnected. And so you see like that real distinct band, starting in northern Alabama, going up along the Tennessee-Carolina border, that it's almost, stretching across the whole mountain range. And when you look outside of the mountain range area, you see a lot more orange and yellow. So you can see where that model would funnel stuff through this mountain range. But when they actually get in the mountain range, there's these distinct bands. There's another one kind of similar where West Virginia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania come together at the top of the map. And then I tried to, make it easier to see and limit it to more of a southeast focus. But if you look in the northeast, it's similar. There's these distinct bands of disconnectivity between Vermont and New Hampshire. And so, while that model is great, the actual reality on the landscape, it's not going to be quite so easy for all the wildlife to move through. And so, thinking about how we connect this landscape, we're working across three scales. We're at the state level, we're at the sub-regional level, and thinking about the whole geography. So at the state level, we're starting to work with West Virginia with their division of highways, with their division of natural resources, and we're going to put in a proposal for a wildlife crossing pilot program grant, for a planning grant, to look at a statewide plan to help mitigate wildlife vehicle collisions, to help ensure connectivity. But we're also, thinking broader than that, bringing the partners here like Wildlands Network, National Parks Conservation Association, of course, the state agencies, and to how can we form like a little state level coalition to just at the very least, be informed of everyone working in the state, or the people that are really focused on connectivity across the state, and how can we coordinate and collaborate and communicate together. And so this is the same map, I showed earlier with the deer crossing. And as you watch this, you're going to see some of the colors start disappearing. And those are deer being lost to mortality. This study found that the number one cause of mortality of deer was hunting, which is great. The second cause of mortality was wildlife vehicle collisions, which is not great. And as we think about, our Appalachian program, we're very deliberate in thinking about connecting the people and the landscape, because if you aren't thinking about this from like the wildlife perspective, think about it from the public safety perspective and the economic perspective. So, public safety, about 2 million wildlife vehicle collisions every year, cost the country as a whole about $10 billion. There's roughly 28,000 people injured every year from these collisions. There's 200 human deaths from wildlife vehicle collisions. On average, if someone in West Virginia hits a deer, it's going to cost $19,000. So that's the total cost. So it's the cost to repair the car, it's the cost for medical bills, it's the cost for lost wages because someone misses a shift or can't go to work as they recover. But it's also costs incurred by the state to send a crew out to pick up the carcass, to send the cops out to respond to the collision, to repair a guardrail that is damaged because the driver swerved to miss the deer and hit a guardrail. And the Central Appalachians has a growing elk population. It's really popular for ecotourism. Of course, there's hunting, but they're also building these watchtowers just for people to go out and stand in a wildlife management area and look at the elk herd as it's moving through. If you hit an elk, it's going to be on average about $70,000 total cost. So repairs, medical, collision response, all of that. So it's a wildlife problem, but it's a people problem too. So thinking about the kind of full suite of benefits from connectivity is how we're also approaching this, and hopefully getting some more additional traction in places where they're not so concerned about the wildlife piece of it. As I mentioned, transboundary is a big piece of our connectivity focus, and so we are working in the Northeast through the Staying Connected initiative. This is a public-private partnership, so it's Canada and the U.S., it's federal, state, NGOs, and tribes. It's a big partnership looking at conserving connectivity in the Northeast, and we're working on this Northeast connectivity framework. So the Northeast doesn't necessarily have something like the SECAS blueprint, but we're trying to think about how we can get the whole Northeast region. And when I say Northeast, we've adopted the Northeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies footprint. So that's Virginia, West Virginia, up through Maine, and then the Canadian provinces again. Thinking about this Northeast connectivity framework, so not necessarily prescriptive, but just this kind of idea of getting all of the partners in the region, so conservation partners, of course, but also transportation departments, fish and wildlife agencies, working forests, agriculture, private landowners, all the stakeholders, all the rights holders, everyone that's in this has a piece to play. And thinking about this framework, starting at some foundational things like a holistic definition of connectivity. Again, a lot of the guidance that comes out is for large game migrations or these large corridors, and that's not necessarily applicable to large portions of the Appalachian Mountains. Well coordinated and integrated approach. Again, a lot of partners working on this, but also thinking, I mentioned this kind of that aquatic connectivity and terrestrial connectivity aren't necessarily separate. And so thinking about if they're, going through and doing a culvert replacement for aquatic connectivity, can we also do some work on that culvert to put a shelf in so that there's terrestrial connectivity? So, we know that if you do that early in the planning and design, it doesn't actually increase the cost that much, but doing it on the back end, retrofitting something is exponentially more expensive. And, generally, if you can get in there early, people are on board, but that takes coordination. It takes kind of some, communication and foresight, knowing that some project's going to come up so you can even plan it and get everything lined up. And then, of course, we know that there's, not enough resources to do this, not enough capacity to do this, but if we can align our actions and coordinate and collaborate, we can be more efficient. We can have more impact with the limited resources we have. And so, again, this Northeast Connectivity Framework, working with the Northeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, they have a landscape conservation committee. And that committee has a few priorities, but State Wildlife Action Plan implementation is a big one. And every swap in the Northeast includes connectivity as a management priority. It includes fragmentation as a conservation threat. So connectivity is a big piece of swap implementation. And then landscape connectivity specifically is one of these priorities. And so we're thinking about this, connectivity framework is this overarching umbrella that kind of guides this work. But we know that a framework just sits on a shelf if we don't have the resources to actually implement it. So that's a big piece that CLLC and some of the NGO partners are working on is funding, bringing in just kind of this, millions of dollars of new investment is our goal to help with this connectivity framework, to help with the coordination. There's a lot of the science is there. We need to synthesize it so that edges are feathered across state borders. There's a lot of great work happening within each state, but less coordination across borders. There's of course policies, there's all sorts of policy gaps. Funding is a big one, but also thinking about policies that inhibit connectivity, as well as policies that promote it. Landowner engagement's a big one. We've identified this as a priority, I think initially around working land. So where are those, forests where they're logging, or their best management practices that, a timber company can harvest what they need for their bottom line, but leave enough trees, leave the composition, leave the location in a state that still allows wildlife to move through it. And then all of this, again, is intended to lead towards on the ground. So protection of priority wildlife areas, actual construction of mitigation structures like underpasses, overpasses. And it's great. There's exciting, the Northeast Transportation and Wildlife Conference. So it used to be this conference that happened every 2 years. They're transitioning into a collaborative to have like a permanent presence in the region, not just a conference that happens every year, but they're bringing in the transportation side of this. So it's been really exciting to, the Fish and Wildlife agencies are on board. The transportation agencies are really interested. And so they have a conference in September where we're going to talk with the leadership of the Northeast Transportation and Wildlife Collaborative on this connectivity framework, and hopefully get their buy-in as we move this forward. And then, working across the whole geography, the whole 2,000-mile mountain range from Alabama up through Maine. And then, initially it's a U.S. focus, but the goal is to expand this across the border into Canada. 2 region-wide initiatives: Appalachian Peoples and Places Conservation Collaborative that SECAS is actually part of. RUA is on the steering committee for this effort. And the blueprint is being real informative on how, some of the GIS work we're doing on prioritization and looking at, what's already connected, what needs to be connected. And then the Campaign for Appalachia, which is a complementary project that's intended to help kind of operationalize this strategy, the Appalachian People and Places Collaborative, and help bring in. So the Appalachian Peoples and Places Conservation Collaborative, it started under the previous administration as a DOI, one of their landscape initiatives. So they had the Central Grasslands, they've had sagebrush, and then towards the end of the previous administration, they identified this Appalachian Keystone Initiative. We got really lucky that when the administration shifted over, the funding was given to Appalachian Mountain Joint Venture to continue this. So it was going to go from like a federally led project, and now it's being led by NGOs, but you can see from the steering committee, there's still a lot of federal engagement on this. And it's intended, the Appalachian People and Places Collaborative is trying to develop, it aims to develop this Appalachian-wide conservation strategy, and then an investment plan, figuring out how much money is needed, where can that money come from, and kind of then building this coalition around this shared strategy for the whole region. And there's, a couple of big tenets for this strategy. One, the big partner-driven, bottom-up, co-produced. So we're not trying to create a new strategy. It's actually been really interesting. We're looking at the existing strategies within the region. So whether it's a state wildlife action plan, a state forest plan, a state outdoor recreation plan, a state resilience plan, we looked at NIFWIF business plans, we looked at watershed plans. The blueprint is part of this. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. We're trying to synthesize what's already in the region. And so figuring out where across these plans, where are goals similar and complementary? And a big piece is where do goals not align? Where are they contradictory? Where does one goal lead to the diminishing of another goal? So it's been really exciting to just kind of look across all these plans and see where there is alignment and where there are gaps, and then use that to inform a region-wide strategy. And that's the region-wide strategy is going to have 3 themes. So landscape conservation and connectivity is the thread that runs through all of it. It's the kind of the key theme that holds it together. Then, of course, a big piece of that is climate change resilience, and then habitat diversity, like I mentioned earlier. We've got all these really unique habitats. They support a bunch of species, and we know that we need to conserve that habitat diversity. That is what the Appalachian Mountains are known for. And then we also know that the Appalachian Mountains have these distinct subregions, and the borders are kind of amorphous. They shift on who you're talking to, but in general, there's a northern Appalachian region that's interested in this international collaboration, this proximity to Canada, fish passage, and improved regional coordination. The central apps are interested in coal field development and sustainable agriculture, especially on small farms. And then the southern apps, you can guess when this kind of was coming under development, but haline recovery is a big piece of this, and then aquatic biodiversity. So thinking about this kind of strategy across the whole mountain range, but also these kind of smaller scale sub-regional strategies and priorities as well. And this is an ongoing project. I think the first draft of this strategy is going to be ready around September, and then it'll be an iterative process to kind of get stakeholder, rights holder, partner input, and then revise and continue to build on this. And we're using like the Central Grasslands Roadmap is kind of another example of something we're using where you've got this large landscape, diverse stakeholders, but they can, come together under this idea of a large scale strategy for conservation where each person, each organization has their part in it. Complementary to this, the Appalachian Peoples and Places Conservation Collaborative is this campaign for the Appalachians. We know that, you have this strategy, but we need, again, resources to implement it. And so one mechanism is this campaign for Appalachians. At the heart of it is a philanthropic campaign to bring in new money into the region and support the people that are in the region already doing the work. Historically, it's a region that's been under-resourced and underfunded. Federal programs have been cut even further. And so to fill those gaps, we're looking at a philanthropic campaign. We've learned through this process that, again, there's a lot of expertise in the region. There's a lot of experience in the region. There's people doing the work on the ground. They just don't have the resources or the capacity to do it at scale. So we want to support the people already doing the work. We want to raise awareness for the global significance, and I say global, I didn't misspeak, for biology and culture. If you look at the Amazon rainforest, philanthropic donors invest in that because of its biodiversity, because of its carbon stores, and because the local communities need help transitioning from an economy that extracts from the Amazon into an economy that conserves the Amazon, provides income, but doesn't destroy the natural resources. And those same conditions exist in the U.S., in the Appalachian Mountains. I talked about, the awesome biodiversity. The Appalachian Mountains have the second highest carbon stores in the U.S. The Pacific Northwest has higher, but this is a huge carbon storage area that's under threat from development. It's under threat from conversion and the loss of that carbon. And then obviously we have these communities that are absolutely on board with transitioning from a resource extraction. They need support in developing a nature positive economy. And so when we think about that, outdoor recreation, of course, that's one of it, ecotourism. But even that working lands piece, we know forestry and timber is a big economic sector within the Appalachians. Agriculture is a big section. So working with those working lands to have a balance between the economic productivity and the conservation benefits. And then we want to tell the story of these people. So it's a philanthropic campaign to raise money and also kind of change the narrative around this Appalachians. And these two region-wide initiatives are very complementary to each other. And we know that, a big piece of this is that the region, the campaign wants to align conservation and community well-being in this region. And we're thinking about this as it's a connected ecological system, but it's a richly differentiated cultural region. And so we're thinking, that's kind of our North Star here is kind of doing the coordination, getting the alignment, getting people pulling in the same direction without erasing that local identity. That's so important for this region is that it's not a region that can necessarily have one voice. It's a region with many voices, and then hopefully they're all, saying the same message. And as I mentioned, these two initiatives are aligned real tightly. So if you look at the Appalachian Peoples and Places Conservation Collaborative, that's the umbrella. And then where that red arrow is, that's the Campaign for Appalachia. The Campaign for Appalachia is intended to provide the funding and the resources boost the capacity of people, the local communities, local organizations to do this work on the ground. So we actually even had an in-person workshop that brought these initiatives together so we could all be in the same room and work through this. So I'll kind of end here. Appalachians is a big region, but just thinking bigger. These 3 states have official wildlife corridor action plans. I probably could have included Alabama in this as well. They've identified corridors through their state wildlife action plan, but these states have a wildlife action plan. Maine and North Carolina have funding from the state budget dedicated to wildlife crossings. Vermont has a 30 by 30 law, which is essentially the state's going to conserve 30% of its land. And it explicitly says that one of those goals is to sustain ecological connectivity. So they've got a law in the books specifically saying the state has to conserve, protect connectivity. New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Maryland have policies where their Department of Transportations need to evaluate wildlife crossing locations and then consider whether one of those is needed or not in capital investment projects. New York, Pennsylvania, and Kentucky and Georgia have wildlife crossing program grants right now where they're doing statewide plans to reduce wildlife collisions, to promote driver road safety, and then to, of course, maintain and restore connectivity. Hopefully, we're going to add West Virginia to this map soon. And then all of the states in this light green, their state wildlife action plan specifically has, a mention of protecting connectivity, restoring connectivity as a conservation action. So looking across this whole region from Texas to Maine, every state, and this is really simplified, Maine also has a wildlife crossing pilot program, and I'm sure I'm missing something here. So if any of this is wrong, let me know. I want to update and keep this map accurate. But from Texas to Maine, every state has some type of plan, some type of policy, some type of funding source, or some type of law saying connectivity needs to occur. And, this is the motivation for coordinating and collaborating, because while every one of these states, they're mandated with doing it within the state, nobody's mandating doing it across the state. And so that's where Center for Large Landscape Conservation, Staying Connected Initiative, the Blueprint, all of us, working together through these network partnerships, these collaboratives, these initiatives, to get connectivity across this whole region. That's how I think, we really become resilient to climate change, how we can adapt to climate change, both human and wildlife populations. And so this is the goal, this is the dream. Hopefully 5-10 years from now, we've made really significant progress where all of these are one color because we've just got this whole connectivity across the whole region. So thank you again. I really appreciate being part of this. Come find me at the Southeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies Conference in October. There's a special symposium partnering across scale, strategies, and sectors to enhance ecological connectivity and support the CFOA Fish and Wildlife Management priorities. Louise Vaughn is going to hopefully be part of this session, so the Blueprint will be represented, and I'd love to just see you there. So thanks again. Really appreciate it. Happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Jacob, for the great presentation. We have probably 10 minutes for questions. So since we have a pretty big group today, I think I'll direct traffic a little bit. So I'll probably just ask people to raise their hand using that function in Teams. And then you can pop yourself off of mute and jump in with your question, or you're also welcome to use the chat. And to get us started, we do already have a question from Andrew in the chat. Can you talk a little bit more about what will be delivered this fall as a plan, if I got that right?
Yes, so we're still figuring out exactly what that plan is going to look like because we bit off a lot. And so I think it'll be a draft. And I think the last meeting we're at is kind of looking at those 3 themes that are Appalachian wide. And so looking under those themes, the strategy is intended to identify goals within those themes. So connectivity, what are some connectivity goals? And we're hopefully not going to reinvent the wheel. We're going to look at the existing goals within each state, within each subregion, and build off of those, because we want people to see themselves in this strategy that I mentioned bottom up. So we want them to look at their already state plan and saying, oh, my work helped contribute to this goal that's also region wide. it's gonna also look at the existing like initiatives that are already kind of making progress towards those goals. Just again, we want to highlight what's actually already being done. And then of course there's going to be some like, actions or strategies that can move the needle towards achieving those themes. So I think one of the motivations for this is like we looked at some of these other large landscape kind of campaigns or initiatives, like the Choose Clean Water Act, which is, the Chesapeake Bay, the Grasslands Roadmap that actually goes from Canada to Mexico, and it has this. And what we found is when you have these like large landscapes and you have this strategy or whatever, a roadmap, a framework, whatever you have, that's actually a pretty powerful piece for then trying to get federal or state legislation that supports it, or going to funders and saying you can, be a small piece of this bigger pie. So that's a long-winded answer to say in the fall, we're hoping to have a first draft of that region-wide strategy that will, absolutely know that we'll have to get input on it and iterate and move it forward. And it's going to be a living document. And we're talking about how we then, what is the sequence for even updating it? So we have this draft, and we'll make iterations towards what is a first final draft. But knowing state wildlife action plans are reviewed on a 10-year cycle. So do we want to review this, region-wide strategy on a 10-year cycle? So we're still figuring out exactly what it looks like. But the goal is to have this, a strategy that highlights what's already happening in the region and how we can continue and accelerate and move that forward.
Awesome. Thanks, Jacob. Great question, Andrew. We have Jim Lyons' hand up if you want to go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, thanks very much, and interesting presentation. I've worked on some of these issues over 30 years, and it's great to see it all coming together. I guess the question I have is how to accelerate and foster more coordination and collaboration in areas like the Northeast. I mean, people show up at the Northeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies meeting, and we have a meeting, and then people go off and do what they do. We're doing some work in northern New Jersey. Through a grant, we just acquired 220 acres of land, which happens to be on the New York-New Jersey border. It coincides with the Appalachian Trail and abuts several state parks. And so we're trying to develop, if you will, an example, a model for how to foster collaboration or coordination, I should say, for wildlife. We're doing inventory work now, but more of these on-the-ground examples, and I'm not saying ours is the best example, but more of these on-the-ground examples and the opportunity to bring people together, not just within the fish and wildlife community, but in the recreation community. The Appalachian Trail runs through the same piece of property, and others might accelerate the process. And I've worked in conservation most of my career, and I know the stovepipe approach to doing business. That's the way we normally work. But this is a recreation opportunity. It's certainly a fish and wildlife opportunity. It's a tourism opportunity, given the proximity of state parks and the people we have that pass through on the AT. I guess, Jacob, the question I have is, and I certainly know the people you work with because I was involved with Ken putting all this together, how to more rapidly hold people together, perhaps on a regional basis, like the region we're talking about, to facilitate that kind of conversation, to better understand what resources are available, because the rec people don't know what the fish and wildlife people have. Yeah. The states don't always benefit from or are aware of what might be available on the national level, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it seems to me that those kinds of in-person gatherings, fostered by an OSI or somebody, could really help accelerate the kind of work that you're doing. I mean, I applaud what you're doing, but I've lived a life of kind of a one-man show, hoping to pull everybody together. And I think we're at this point, and I credit Ken and the folks out in Montana who kind of initiated all this. But I think the opportunities are there, and a tremendous opportunity exists here in the Northeast to try to promote this because of the high interest in outdoor recreation, because of the development pressures and the interest that communities interested in wildlife and conservation have in trying to foster ways to protect these key corridors while allowing some responsible growth. So your thoughts on maybe how to accelerate from your perspective, where you are now and the work you're doing, this process. And again, I think AFWA has been instrumental in this, NIAFWA some, but I think it's time to do some stuff on the ground by gathering people with resources from the state and local level, and seeing if the conservation groups and the government agencies can't finally get their shit together and really make this happen, because we've been talking about it now for decades, and I think, Hillary, you would agree with that.
Yeah, great question. I've got two thoughts. One is I think we do need more implementation. These, like, wildlife crossing structures work when it's properly designed, when it's put in the right location, when it's fenced off like it's supposed to be. They've reduced collisions by 98% over the lifespan. There's some of them even pay for themselves just by reducing the cost. So we need more on the ground projects that, I mean, they benefit the wildlife, of course, but then we can point to them and say, this is what we're trying to work towards. And, also, we're from the nonprofit, the NGO side of things, like, that's also what funders want to see. They want to see a concrete project. So I think we do need more, and that takes some work to get to there. You got to have the science to, identify those locations. You got to have policies and funding in place. But thinking about more of those, like, actual projects, like you said, that's one piece we need, and we've got the evidence to show that these projects have beneficial outcomes. The second piece is you have to have intentional coordination. I mean, that's the other thing. You've got to have an organization or an association like NEAF, where they've got a landscape conservation committee that does this at the state level. That's why the Network for Landscape Conservation specifically tries to fund emerging networks and coordinators, because you have to have someone intentionally trying to do that, because if not, it's no one's job. And everyone's, they've got so much on their plate, and they only have jurisdiction or authority in a specific location. But we've also found, like, there are just some barriers. There's a state in the Northeast where, due to policies and leadership culture, like, their transportation agency and their fish and wildlife agency don't interact, and there's, like, laws in place that prevent employees from, like, transferring between those agencies. If they go from the transportation agency to the fish and wildlife agency, their experience doesn't come with them, and so as a state employee, you're less likely to move from transportation to wildlife if you have to reset your clock. And so there's just some, like, structural barriers that need to be removed in order to promote this coordination and collaboration. And no one wants to fund just a network. Like, there's very few people that want to fund that coordination. They want to fund the project to implement it, but it takes a lot of work to get towards that implementation project. So it really comes from two pieces. We need, committed, dedicated, specific coordinating across these different sectors. They have to want to be coordinated as well. And then we also need to get more projects on the ground. It can't just all be plans.
So could I just quickly respond? I agree with what you said. Concrete projects, yes, but they don't have to be concrete, is what I want to say.
No, yeah.
Which
I meant physical projects.
But that's what gets everybody's attention, and these projects tend to go through DOTs, etc. I mean, if the agencies, the rec agencies and the wildlife agencies would come together and identify some of those existing corridors, that maybe cross a road somewhere but don't require structures to deal with it, I think people would be amazed at what already exists. So just something to think about in the work that you're doing, particularly in the Northeast. There's so much opportunity, given the lands that are conserved in parks and forests and in wildlife areas, that could highlight some of the potential and maybe be the catalyst for people putting money into concrete projects that will further those efforts. I mean, the opportunity is right before us, and that's why I decided to do what I did: buy a piece of land and try to demonstrate that we can actually do this. So the potential is there, and we're working with OSI to try to do some of that. But I think that would really accelerate things. I applaud your efforts. I've been involved in wildlife for too long, and now I'm trying to do it on the ground because I was frustrated because I couldn't get many of these projects done the way you're trying to do it.
Yep. Nope. Thanks for your input. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Given the time, I think I'm going to go ahead and take back the sharing and just wrap up with a quick preview of next month's web forum, so you all know what to expect. Let me get my screen shared again here, and I'm going to ask my colleague Louise to go ahead and share a link to register for this web forum. Our next web forum is going to be the 20th of August, also via Teams. Registration link is coming in the chat. We're going to be hearing from Melanie Vanderhoof and Todd Hawbaker with U.S. Geological Survey, and they're going to be presenting on the development of remotely sensed burned area and fire history metrics, which have been extensively used in the new fire frequency indicator that's been developed for the upcoming version of the Southeast Conservation Blueprint, version 2026. So we'll be talking about some of the remote sense products that feed into this, the development of the fire history metrics, and progress toward improving those metrics, and hopefully expanding coverage from the continental United States to the US Caribbean, which would obviously be really exciting. So if you're interested in fire or remote sensing, please definitely tune in for that next month. And then I'm going to toss it over to Rua here to talk a little bit about the updates to the goal report that are underway for our 2026 update.
Yeah, so speaking of fire and the goal report, so right now we're working on the analysis stuff, crunching all the numbers. It'll be out early next year. We update it every 2 years, but I do have the analysis done for the new fire frequency indicator using some of the results that you'll hear about in the webinar. And so we actually have now trends of area that's in its historic fire regime over time, going from 2011 to 2025 at this point, since we have 2025 data. So that's really exciting. And we have that we can summarize for you at multiple scales, or for your custom project area, or for any of the other stuff. So really excited about being able to do that. So that's ready. And another thing that I'm in the midst of working on that we've cracked is that thanks to the folks at the GAP program who brought us updated models of regional species of greatest conservation need. One really cool thing that happened along the way with those updated models is that they ran them for 2016 and 2023. So changes in land cover. And so for the goal report, we're going to be looking at changes in potential habitat for all those regional species of greatest conservation need. So imperiled amphibian and reptiles and mammals. So we're going to be looking at changes, and I've got stuff kind of basically running for those changes. And that's really exciting to be able to look at that potential habitat change over time. But also we can do some really cool reporting for y'all for your sort of focus areas or places. I was just running some watersheds. And so we can summarize, basically what species have increasing potential habitat, what hasn't changed, what's declining, and what species those are. So we're able to generate nice little cool lists of what species seem to be going up with potential habitat, staying the same, or declining. So yeah, we got a lot of fun stuff, but I've got that working for amphibians and reptiles. We should have that soon for mammals. And again, this is the kind of stuff that user support folks can help you out with.
Thanks, Rua. Yeah, so stay tuned for that. I think that'll be a really great update to the goal report, which we sometimes call recent trends in southeastern ecosystems. So then this is the slide I always like to end on, how to get more involved in your partnership. You can learn more about SECAS at secassoutheast.org on our website. We actually have a cool update to our website coming very soon. I think that should be released by the end of this month. So you can read about that in the SECAS newsletter. So I do encourage you to subscribe to our list so that you can get 2 monthly emails, one a reminder email about this webinar, so you never miss a topic that you're interested in. And the other is our once monthly newsletter, which always has great opportunities to get involved. You can connect with your staff. Our smiling faces and contact information are on the staff page. We'd love for you to explore the conservation blueprint and let us know if you have any feedback on how to improve it. We're also available to provide free support to anyone who would like to use the blueprint in their work, whether that's to inform a conservation plan, help strengthen a grant proposal. We can write letters of support, for example. We would love to hear from you about how we can help. And so with that, I think we can pause one more time for questions, but I do see we're at the top of the hour. So I will probably just say a huge thank you to Jacob for this wonderful presentation. Thanks to all of you guys for tuning in. And I hope that you will join us again in August to learn more about those great prescribed fire metrics. Jacob, I don't know if you are able to hold on one more minute. If anybody had an additional question that they'd like to sneak in. All right, I'm not hearing any. So everyone have an awesome rest of your week, a great weekend, and hopefully we'll see you in August. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, y'all.
Thanks, everyone.